Welcome to the 2 Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take one giant book, break it down bit by bit, and talk about it. I used to have a longer spiel, but Brian complained that it was too academic and that we never do any of those things. So the new spiel, we just talk about a book. And we're starting a new season today, and the book in question is William Gaddis's JR, which was just released by our special guest, Edwin Frank, the head of NYRB Books. And I'm also joined this week by Mauro Javier Cardenas, who's the author of The Revolutionaries Try Again, and more recently, Aphasia, which came out over the summer, right?
November.
Oh, it's even more recent. I think I had it early. So welcome. Thank you both for coming on. Brian couldn't be here today. He has to get his knee replaced or something. So he's gone, but I don't think it's that serious, but it's something. But so it's just the three of us, and we're going to be talking about the first 70 pages approximately, depending on which edition you have, or the first 11 scenes of JR. But I think generally it'll be more interesting to get your perspective as we kick this off for everyone who hasn't read JR, hasn't read William Gaddis, how you both came to William Gaddis, and what your feelings are. And Edwin, do you want to start and explain how you came to end up reprinting this giant tome?
Well, let's see. I hadn't read Gaddis for a long time, and in fact, it was only when it was obvious that it became, when I found out that both books were available, that I read JR. So I'd read the Recognitions back when I was in college, with mixed feelings in a way, but no question that it was a remarkable and completely original book. Even as it's a book all about how it's impossible to be completely original. So with JR, I ventured into it knowing, this was a book I'd meant to read for a long time, but hadn't. And I guess with the usual sense that we've all been told this is a difficult book, which is both. Well, I'm rereading this section, which I read relatively recently for the first time. And then, as is often the case with long and intricate books, I ended up reading it. You read the beginning more often than you read the end, because you actually have to find your way into it. So I must have read the beginning of Proust at least 7 times before and the end maybe. So I put the book down for a while and lost the thread of it and had to go back to the beginning. And now again, I reread. It's this time reading these pages, I was struck that this is a book that gets funnier the more you actually, the more you're familiar you are with it. And though certainly there's still things where I find myself putting a question mark beside, and there are these things Gaddis leaves you hanging. So you only find out what a detail means sometime later, and you may have forgotten on a given reading what detail that is, but later you come back and it falls into place and so on. The way in which it introduces the main themes. I mean, it is sort of these sections we've been reading are kind of, given the Wagner background, sort of the prelude to the whole thing, with all the different themes and leitmotifs being sounded, and JR just sort of waiting in the wings. But that.
Yeah, absolutely. Mauro, how did you come to Gaddis? I'm going to loop back to you, Edwin, because I have a story I can sort of tell about the reprint of this book too.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want me to go?
Yeah.
Oh, so I actually found the source of how I got interested in Gaddis is the issue of Conjunctions from 2003 that has a portfolio on Gaddis that was edited by Rick Moody. And it has people like Paul Auster, Coover, Don DeLillo talking about Gaddis. And I remember I haven't reread all of it, and I'd forgotten most of it. But what I remember distinctly is Rick Moody in the introduction saying, when you read JR, you should read it quickly. Don't worry about who's talking. Don't try to figure out what is, what exactly is the dialogue, where is it coming from. Just read it quickly. And so the first time I read JR, especially that first scene with the 2 old ladies, right? Just kind of, it's almost like it's really like a buddy comedy, and it's always interesting how books get a certain reputation, and so you enter them in these sort of somber, kind of studious point of view. It's like, okay, now I'm going to read a great book. But then you start reading it, it's like, it's just a buddy comedy. Two old ladies shooting the breeze, and this lawyer trying to get an award in and can't, and they're just like, it's hilarious, right? And that sort of first scene and that sort of approach stayed with me so much that in my first book, I try to emulate that in a horizontal way, whereas that Gaddis goes vertically in the dialogue. In my first book, there's a chapter where there's only M dashes that go horizontally, and there is no attribution of who's talking, and it's very chatty. It's exactly as chatty as those chapters. So that was my intro to JR.
It's interesting. That's interesting. I read Carpenter's Gothic first, which I don't know. I mean, how that happened seems bizarre. It must have been referenced in like something I was reading at the time in college, because it was in college, and I read that. I was like, this is great. And then it was during like a winter break that I picked up Recognitions and then JR and worked through those over like a winter and a summer because they're so giant. So this is a controversial story that I'm going to dance around so that I don't get sued. But one of the reasons that the rights were available for you guys to reprint this is because of I am in Normal, Illinois, in a Hyatt in Normal, Illinois, to go through the papers of Delkey Archive Press's office and find all that we can find. And Delkey had been the last publisher of JR. I think there's still copies like in a green warehouse here somewhere, like literally. So they had this, but there was an employee who sabotaged the emails of the other employees and hacked them and deleted series of emails from the agent regarding this, which led to the book's rights being reverted.
I heard that story too from somebody else who was working with John before. Yeah.
Yep.
Because I was surprised when it came up, so without any doubt that I was interested at that point.
Exactly. So it's such like a weird, like very weird thing to have happened. Yeah. But I have a question for you, because when I started rereading this, like one of the things that you reminded me of a story of that. So you guys reset this.
Yeah.
You relayed it out. When I was at Delkey, back in 2004, we had to relay out Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein. Oh, yeah. And it was at the point in time where like scanning was literally cutting the book apart, taking one page, scanning it through an OCR program, flipping it over, scanning the next page. It was like one intern's project for the summer, and he had to like scan every page and proof it against the original to make sure that all the same repetitions were in the right.
Yeah. Jesus, that nightmare proofing job.
And I thought about whoever had to proof this would be like, this sucks. Like, I don't want to have to prove this. Like, this is impossible. And then it's like, well, yeah, at least it's not Making of Americans.
Yes. Exactly.
Man. So we want to start. Let's just go through. This is one of the things that's really interesting about JR that I've always really liked, is how like specifically like episodic it is. That there are like things that kind of move, and there are the exposition that sort of takes you from one scene to another. But for the most part, it is fairly clean in terms of like what the scenes are. Like the information is all over the place, and there's too much, like you say, Edwin, to like remember what you're supposed to pick up on, and even like at times figure out what's going on. And I think for anyone who's reading for this for the first time, we won't necessarily have any spoilers, because I don't clearly remember how this all unfolds, but there are little things that are hidden in here that I think are worth like just trying to frame and explain like what's going on. And so that first scene is like a big one. So it has the lawyer Cohen, and then Anne and Julia Bast are he's talking to them about their brother's death. It is their brother, right? Yeah. Yeah. And they had two brothers, and Edward is the son of one of those two.
The one who has died.
The one who
has died. The other brother is alive still, though you never see him in the book.
And he's a composer, but he had adopted, or he raised Edward. So we have like similar to this is like a long roundabout way to get to like this thing, but like
he also went off with Edward's supposed father's wife.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So like with Nabokov's Ada that we just finished, we have another situation of like multiple family members raising each other's kids and having questions of lineage, like right from the jump. But yeah, so he's there because the very wealthy man has passed away, is the father of Edward, although Edward was supposedly raised by his brother, and the mom was the same. Went from like being married to the dead brother to being married to the brother who is still living, who's the composer.
Right.
That's all right?
Yeah, I think so. That's one of the hardest things to get straight in one's mind in starting this book. And that, anyway, yeah.
And the real question is like if he's the legal heir, because the wealth would trickle down to him, and the lawyer wants him to sign a paper, basically have him sign a paper saying that he is not the heir. Correct?
No, I think the lawyer's in the dark as to how old he is and all sorts of things here at the beginning, right? So there's all that weird dialogue about infant and so on. And the two sisters are refusing to actually, I mean, they sort of ignore all his questions. And then, of course, there's the further I was noticing this time that early on he says Cohen without an H. After which, relentlessly, whenever they speak of him, it's spelled with an H. So it's this sort of joke at the level of orthography, which is a silent sort of joke in terms of what's actually going on in the room. But the point is that they're completely convinced he's Jewish, and they're, of course, completely anti-Semitic.
Yeah, exactly. They also go so far as to say, like, oh, then when he leaves his card, they're like, oh, here's his card, and his name's misspelled on it. He should have got them.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I hadn't noticed that going on.
I love that. And there's
that comes in like scene 11, right? Yeah. I think on that first scene, what you know, this second time that I read it, I started sort of taking notes on all the different modalities that are included in that first scene, which a lot of them obviously are repeated, which is the one that I mentioned earlier, right? Which is this digressive body comedy, right? The two old ladies kind of connecting. The second one is, and this happens all over, like the slapstick element, you know, something's always falling, you know, the glasses, the button, something always needs repair. The other one is that the legal language gets introduced. And then there's the stylized descriptive language, right? Which is, it's highly stylized to the point that I often think, like, is this parody of something? Because it's so stylized in the way that is done. And then there's also, he also introduces the notion of stylizing in the actual dialogue itself, because there are parts of the dialogue that, although the JR often talk about like being chatty and being about like how people speak, he also introduces phrases that are not part of the oral tradition, that are just stylized ways of speaking. So he's setting up the way in which the book is going to work, which is, yes, people will speak in certain ways, but also I would stylize the way they speak, right? The language of legality will come in. The language later, the language of pedagogy, I don't know how you pronounce it in English, but pedagogy, and how that's used for comic effect. But in the majority of those things are actually used for comic effect, right? I mean, there's obviously a lot of plot elements, but a lot of this is sort of comedy based, right? Like things falling, you know, the language is often used, the legal language is often used, you know, with a straight face, but you're meant to laugh because like you were just having this sort of fun conversation between two people, and then this lawyer talks about all this legalities and whatever, and like it's funny.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I was thinking of it this time through of like, I just finished reading A Frolic of His Own, which I had never read. And it was like the last Gaddis book to read. So I did it right before this. And that was all based in legal speak too. And in here, the legal speak that comes up at the beginning made me think that there's like a real balance in his work between the pure entropy, like the things falling apart, all the stuff that's in the one guy's pockets. That's the part that scene always sticks with me every time that he's like taking shit out of his pockets. Everything's like falling apart. Everything's like wrecked. And that the legal speak is to try and make things precise and try and create like very clear legalistic ways to like address things. Like even the infant term that you mentioned, like it's explained as a legal term and all the legal ramifications of that. Like the legal language is trying to make sense out of the chaos of information, and is also like being upended by like the parody of it and by the humor and by the fact that nobody understands, and they just keep like ignoring and that will don't understand.
Yeah.
No, I mean, these technical languages always fail at their effort too, and often are. I mean, once you get to the scenes at the school, the pedagogical language isn't even really pedagogical. It's the new business speak of America. The way that, you know, use is always qualified as utilize.
Right.
By the principle.
Terrible word.
Utilizes. That's the important kind of. You know, but the point. those bridge passages, it's interesting. I don't think what happens in them is often comic, because they often are, often cars tearing away with a squeal of wheels and almost filmic in their effect. But I think also that there is supposed to be a kind of lyric density in them that is supposed to sound a kind of elegiac note underneath all the destruction and confusion and craziness that's going on. So in a way, I think they are also the most serious. They are a kind of ground note that is a serious note that's being sounded.
Yeah, those are the least favorite of mine because they're not, they're almost like, some of them are actually, to me at least, a bit ponderous, which is really odd in the way they get constructed with the actual dialogue, which is so funny and like quick and
And they're very like impressionistic too.
Yeah, there was one in the reading for today. I think it's when Decephalus is going back home, where I wasn't sure that Gaddis wasn't actually sort of channeling a little bit of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, that there was a certain sort of and I didn't check Steve Moore's thing to see if there was allusion, but this sort of fall, time passing kind of thing was going on. But I mean, equally, they're the ones that are funny because of all the trees that are being slaughtered up and down the street in the suburb, where they're progressively dismantling everything beautiful and habitable about it in the name of progress, and though again it's actually in the name of entropy. Yeah.
There's one other part that's really important, I think, that to ground this for people who are reading it for the first time, is that the brother that dies is James, correct? Am I misremembering?
No, it's Thomas.
Thomas dies, and James is the one who is still alive. So Thomas made his money off of player pianos, correct?
He seems, he and that becomes something in this novel, which in one way a very traditional novel, an inheritance story, is, I mean, the issue of who will inherit this player piano factory becomes one of the ongoing motifs of ongoing issues of the book. But at the same time, he seems to have sued to try and stop, or was it James who tried to? James, the composer, tried to block the existence of the piano because it was a travesty of what he sees as music,
as art.
And the brother then took over the factory and promoted it.
Exactly. Anything that's a reproduction is suspect to like the pure artist, right? So like the mechanical reproduction of the sounds. And yeah, so that's where their fight, they had that falling out, which is also very funny. I think it might be in scene 11. And the two are kind of wrapped in my mind because they're both in the house with the two old ladies.
With the ladies, right.
And we read it first and last. So it might be in the last one, but where they describe like how they got into a fight. Like the last time they saw each other was like they arrived in like Paris.
Oh yeah.
And they just start punching each other. It's like super funny. But yeah, so that's the dichotomy too. And Edward's in between that as a composer who may be the heir to this player piano fortune and is also trying to like make sense out of shit and like and make a great composition or become a great musician. So that's part of like one of the themes that comes up a lot throughout here too.
Yeah, and I had a question for both of you, and I don't know if you read about it or have some thoughts about it, which is so Gaddis, after starting with JR, follows a very similar style, right, of this sort of dialogue base, and I was rereading JR, I was wondering, the choices that he made, like what does that mean for his approach to what he feels character is or isn't? And what I mean by that is when you write this way, you're basically almost implicitly saying that I don't believe in interiority. I don't care about interiority. All that matters is the talking, right? All that matters is people talking to one another. There are different registers to it, and so on and so on. It's a very sort of strange choice to make in a way for literature, right? Because literature often sort of thrives in sort of dramatizing interiority and so on. And when you only have that, you tell yourself that that's mostly going to be your option, right? You know what you're leaving out, right? So I'm wondering if if that came to mind for either of you or both of you. Have you read Gaddis talk about that somewhere?
I haven't. Have you, Edwin?
I haven't. I mean, I could think of It's interesting. You're right. It's something that very few novelists do. If I think of precursors in doing it, Henry James's The Awkward Age is a book almost entirely conducted in dialogue, and also about a decadent society. But you never know. There you do have interiority, but it basically comes from you're guessing what everybody's hiding, because everything they say can't be relied on. But you don't have that kind of point of view play exactly in this book. And Ivy Compton-Burnett does something like that. Yeah. I think it's not entirely. I think there's some awkward. I mean, I think that in some ways Gaddis paints himself into a corner which he rather brilliantly then inhabits. But there are characters in the book. Edward, to some extent, though Edward gets more and more cornered by JR in ways, but and also Gil, the teacher, who are meant to represent forms of critical intelligence and critical. I mean, and also of a certain. Well, they're supposed to have either a desire to be an artist or have a certain compromised wisdom, but you're supposed to believe it's real to some extent, and I guess they are present by, I mean, Gil increasingly is somebody who can't find a way to write a book. So it's not being able to find a words that is the sign that actually he really cares about what his words mean, as opposed to the publicist you later meet, who's one of the great creations of this book. I mean, it's just the greatest, you know, who just erupts with verbiage and means absolutely nothing.
I mean, what you get from this approach that I find wonderful is that you get chaos. Mm-hmm. You get chaos in the way that you don't get in other books, right? Because that's your mode, right? People are going to be talking, and there's going to be multiple layers of sort of dialogue and, like, you know, stuff streaming from the closed circuit. And so that, to me, you know, is the beauty of it. It's just what you gain, the chaos that you gain from the approach.
It's interesting because it really is like death of an author side of things too, in the sense that when you're talking about the interiority and the descriptions, like that is very fiction. That is very much a fiction and a creation of the writer. And here it's like almost like supposed to be a record, like almost supposed to be just the sounds of what you hear, like that what everyone hears. There's no like hidden stuff to it, like you're saying. It's kind of interesting. I think it's really interesting. I think I don't think anyone can do it quite like this. The only book that comes close in my mind is A Naked Singularity. It has like a lot of bits that are similar by Sergio de la Pava, but even that's like, I haven't read anything that's like a sustained 770 page dialogue driven book that like works.
Yeah.
Yeah, because even Naked Single. Go ahead, Evan.
Well, there are little. There's a there's an ongoing. The text signals its own messages independent of what is said by people. So, for example, there's the joke where I can't remember who's explaining. Is it Gibbs is explaining entropy, and he's spelling it out, and he spells E-N, and then he says he doesn't say T. You see the person he's talking to say D.
Yeah.
So suddenly you have, you know, this pun that is going on at which is a mistake again, of course, and is a slippage, which illustrates what's both being said, but also in some sense, you know, sort of picks it up in a way. So there are lots of textual jokes going on, which are there for the reader to sort of pick up on.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like clearly an artistic structure to like who's talking to whom and where things move and how it develops that really makes it work. But it is a really interesting approach. Let's talk about the school for a second. So the school, let me see if I can explain this right. Correct me. The school has been given money by a foundation to have essentially community-based learning with TVs in every room that are also broadcast out to the local community so that everyone can learn from these teachers who are presenting various topics, including anatomy, but the anatomy is made out of car parts, I believe. Right?
Oh, is that what's going on? I hadn't, there is that whole car part thing. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and they keep saying, like, where did he get this from? You're like, he made it himself. I think it's supposed to be a body, like a skeleton of car parts. And that's kind of the joke there. There's also, then Edward has to give a talk on Mozart that's gets all screwed up because it's supposed to be for Wagner, but it's not, and has the wrong, more of your textual errors are in there where he's like saying the wrong things. But the foundation had given them money to do this. The foundation is then there to check up on them or to evaluate how the system's going. And they weren't expecting them. They were expecting them on Friday. It's not Friday. It's maybe Wednesday, whatever it is. And so they're there, and there's a sense of chaos because none of the things are working right. Like none of the programs, and they're trying to figure out the budget and really want it to be like a closed circuit thing and no longer be out to the outside world, which is another entropy moment of like keeping it, the more you can keep things contained, the less you can keep the less entropy can impact it. Although once you make a dome or whatever, like a ball, that everything has to fall apart within that, right? So like there's that side of the entropy thing too, but those are the main things that are happening at the school in this section, right?
Have they been hacked, as we would say now? Is that what, I mean, because they, again, the presentation keeps being screwed up, so I wasn't sure whether the open circuit thing meant that they were somehow liable to other people, in fact, pirating their waves. But that sounds, I don't think that the time that this was written, such a thing would have been necessarily possible. So that may be, affected by our subsequent experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it really, describing it though feels like 2020, like school right now. Like, yeah, like just like fucking put shit on a screen and like there you go, you learned it. There you're learning. Yeah, I don't know if they're hacked, but I think that I know that there's the concerns about like what they say that like it's always old folks' homes and churches that are always watching all their programs and are like offended by them in various ways. And it reminds me that when I went to school at Michigan State, and there was my psychology professor did one of these. They used to have these sort of community classes, right? Like we teach a lecture and it'd be broadcast to like local airwaves, local retirement homes and whatnot. And he had to do one on sexuality. And he said that the university refused to allow him to have any nudity during this because it was being broadcast live. So he claims that he stood in front, like near the camera, like where I am, and had any student who wanted to walk behind him naked to describe like whatever he was talking about in returns of sexuality. So that it was like, this lasted like one episode of him talking just a parade of naked co-eds behind him for East Lansing. which I think ties in perfectly to this.
Yeah, right. And they're also preparing the school budget, right? Because that's the other issue going on.
Yes.
And I'm not quite, I mean, so they begin in whatever scene it is by counting up the different things they're going to allocate money for, most notably not books, right? Because
the books is like
books cause problems. So, I mean, the travesty that is American education is also being taken up here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think what I love about that section is that is this sort of like the different, you have layers of multiple people talking, and then Gaddis is like, oh, and by the way, I'm going to add now what's happening on the actual screen, right? So you have the stuff in a different font. So now you have even more layers of things happening, more layers of things being interrupted, more comedy, more chaos than you had before, which is amazing, right? It's
yeah. It is. So maybe one way we could go through it by scenes, but another way is also just to pick apart the characters, because this is, like you mentioned in the Wagner theme of this is like very much an overture or a prelude where we're getting introduced to a lot of people like really fast, and like their voices will become very clear within like not that long. But in this first scene, like they're all in the same office. Like looking at Steve Moore's notes for this, it's scene 4, school principal's office, conference held between would you say Flash? Because that's super funny. Miss Flash, Decephalus, Whiteback, Gall, Major Hyde, Congressman Pecci joins, all while watching teaching programs on the television, which has more there. And then Decephalus leaves to deliver something. But that's like 6 characters plus the people that are on the screen teaching, which is a lot of voices to like sort of piece through and figure out who is who and who is doing what. And the one that threw me off this time, weirdly, and I don't know why, I mean, it's such a minor note, but that the principal also owns a bank?
Yes.
Okay.
The principal is the head of the bank. And that then ties in eventually to the financial shenanigans, and is why the school's budget is tied up with JR's larger empire, I think. Because JR has it in him to bring down the bank. I think that's roughly the thing. But yeah, he's the head of the bank.
Yep.
So there's that early scene where Bast, what is the kid who is supposed to be the kid who's off the scale of Decephalus's standardized testing, comes up and pulls and points a gun or something like that, a pretend gun.
Yeah.
Bear drops all the money she's going to take to her social studies class, where she's going to take the kids to the stock exchange later in the day, and Bast bends down to pick it up, and somebody then says to the principal, "I just robbed your bank." It's another teacher in the school.
The coach does. Coach
the coach does. And I was wondering, has he robbed the bank, or is that just a joke? I
went and read that section twice and looked into Steve Sinks. I was like, wait a second, like, what is happening here? Like, is this some sort of joke? I don't remember the coach super well, aside from like him doing the lessons, the anatomy lessons.
No, he ends up speaking the most literary English in the whole thing, with all these literary allusions. So it's a totally anomalous thing. And I think he also ends up being a sex criminal too. So, I mean, there is a criminal side to it.
Amazing.
I can't recall. Is he the one? There's one passage where the language is like really flowery, and it doesn't make sense that he's saying it. And then I looked at the Steve Moore notes, and it was like, oh, it's quoting from The Grecian Urn by Keats. I'm like, what?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, no, I think it is the coach who improbably is just full of all these literary references.
Just like all coaches. Decephalus is one of my favorites too. So his character is basically doing the standardized testing, like trying to find ways to standardize, to make sure that this is such a perfect still education system today sort of thing, of trying to find ways to like evaluate and know what students are smart at, good at, and what they could be doing for their future using like coded cards and whatnot. And the kid that you're talking about with the gun is the one that totally screws it up, because he's like just completely inept in every way, and yet like has the highest math and music scores. Like it's very like, it's really like, well, the system doesn't work. And so Decephalus, in like a very like early sabermetric sort of thing, is trying to figure out like what the baselines would be and how best to have these things calculated. And so I love him. He's like he like hits a sort of soft spot for me of like people who like weird math things. And he's the one that has all the shit in his pockets. Like I found that section. I'm just gonna read this because it's so funny. He gets home and and he's talking to his dad or whatever. It says, "Who?" Decephalus asked vaguely, his hands now filling with the contents of an inside pocket, a tape measure, an automatic pencil calibrated in centimeters, a notebook thumb index with attached pen bearing magnifying glass, or, as it turned in his hand, magnifying glass bearing pen, digits, holes, and the legend "Do not fold or mutilate" born on a green card, an orange card, on 2, 3, 4 white cards, a length of string, a length of twine, a waller glazed with soiled detentions, a linen counter, a perforation gauge, a letter with 4 place numbers as its return address. It's like an impossible amount of stuff all in like a pocket. I love that. I don't know why, but that one always gets me.
Well, he has that. I mean, and this section introduces his sad marriage, which is, of course, another one of the themes that gets carried on, developed all through that. Yeah.
This time around.
What's that?
I would say this time around, not to jump around too much, but I didn't notice it the first time that JR is actually Alberich in the ring. Yeah. And probably one of my favorite moments, of that sort of when they're practicing is when that guy shows up with a trumpet, and he's in the wrong room, right? He's supposed to be in some kind of rehab thing, and he's like, "Well, I don't really know Wagner, but I'll play this other tune," and he starts playing. I love that.
I wasn't sure that he was because he shows up, an old guy with a saxophone, and then I wasn't sure that wasn't Decephalus' father.
I thought it was.
I think it is, right? Because Decephalus' father is also when Decephalus gets home, and then there's Major Hyde's son, who plays the trumpet and the drums. He plays manly things, right? And he plays the trumpet voluntary in the middle of the performance of The Ring, because of course that's the only piece he knows, you know.
Yep, he just knows a one. Wait, one thing I wasn't clear on is the major's son, the one that plays the trumpet. Is he also the kid that holds up the gun and the pretend robber?
No, but he's like he's JR's sort of friend through the rest of the book, right? But that anyway, they're usually sitting together when they take trips and things like that.
I mean, that is the
I think the other I don't think it's. I think the idiot savant is a different character.
Good. Okay. That's what I thought. That I wasn't sure when it hit that if that's true or not. Yeah, the major is really interesting too, and has his great recurring lines of like, let's go to my bunker. Let's take these cameras and let me show you a bunker. This is America. This is where we can stay. We'll be safe. This is true America. That's where your camera should be. Forget all this other nonsense. Like, we don't need that. We need the bunker.
Which is specifically a nuclear shelter that he's built somehow. But how is that tied together with the waste disposal theme, which is also a theme that is developed in all this? And it's as if the major either has some stake in the town's sewage, or and then of course it gets worked into quite coincidentally, Bast ends up working it into his presentation of Mozart's life, which is supposed to be this sort of saccharine thing about the lovely composer who made the most beautiful music and had the most faithful wife whose name was Constanza and so on. But in fact, Bast starts revealing that all of this is nonsense, and actually it's the absolute opposite is true, and then starts going on all of Mozart's favorite scatological jokes, all on the open source.
Yeah, I mean, waste is everything in this too. Like, it really is. And someone just commented that that's what America is about, is waste.
I think it's high to keep saying waste disposal. America, that's what America, you know what I mean?
It's like that scene in early scene in Gravity's Rainbow where he goes down the toilet and it's like, that is America is shitting money.
Yeah.
And basically.
Yeah, well, and that theme is being established here from the beginning. I mean, of course, the book begins significantly with money, the sound of it. And yeah, I mean, this reminds me of little grace notes I hadn't noticed before, which is at the end of the interview of Cohen and the two sisters. He leaves some change by accident, and they pick up the quarter, and they say it's obviously counterfeit because it's actually because you can see the brass through it. But the book is written right after the shift from actual silver quarters to alloy quarters with a silver cover. So in fact, it's the real. I mean, I can remember 1970, whatever it was, but it was that moment when suddenly quarters started showing this a little bit of brass on them, and so that's the real thing that they've picked up, but they think it's some kind of fake quarter.
Yeah, anyway. Exactly. No. It's so fun. It's so fun, and it really is. This is a very musical book in so many ways, not just because of the voices, but in that structure and like how these themes are being developed and the motifs that are just going to keep coming back in different forms. This first 70 pages is, I can imagine it being somewhat of a challenge the first time, but it's also just enjoy it. Like, anyone who's reading this for the first time should just definitely enjoy it, and let it go, because you will catch up. But hopefully this podcast will help too, and just sort of putting those references in place. But it really is a set of motifs that will develop and develop and develop and develop. And it's okay to be confused at the start here.
And it's true, the thing about reading it fast. I mean, actually, that was something I remember reading about Pound's Cantos, Donald Davies saying. And it's true, if you sit there and try and figure it all out, you haven't been given the information to figure it out. You just have to let it sort of flow, and you get to recognize the people, and it comes together. Not all together. There are always little mysteries and jokes and secrets, which is part of the pleasure when you go back.
Yeah, and I think enjoying some of the borderline incoherent nonsense sort of talk sometimes. I'll give you an example that I thought it was hilarious. It's on page 47 on my copy, which maybe it makes sense to you, but it says, in simple, straightforward terms, Dan, you might say that he structured the material in terms of the ongoing situation to tangibilitate the utilization potential of this one-to-one instructional medium in such a meaningful learning experience that these kids won't forget it for a hell of a long time. How's that, Whiteback? I read that, I was just like, I don't know what that exactly means, but it's funny. It's funny how he uses the language of different trades for comic effect, for incoherence, right? I mean, there's so many passages like that. Anyway.
There's
Gibbs later I think says to Whitehead or whatever the principal's name is, says, where'd you learn that tangibilization or whatever,
Oh yeah, he says
telling him about it.
Speak of tangibilitating on planlessness, where you picked that language right back. Yeah, I was like, what?
One of the things that struck me this time, the first time I read this, I remembered this as I was going back through. I'm like, oh my God, I forgot all about that. Is that the principal always says, like the AHM is like his tick, which is like the character from South Park. Like the one teacher who's always like has that same sort of tick. And I remember reading this and being like, oh my God, it's him. And like the first time I hit it, that visual came into mind immediately of the one teacher from South Park.
It's a good point you're making too for readers, is that there are ticks of speech that you begin to realize identify specific characters as you go along, and so there's that way in which there's a kind of, you soon begin to notice that.
Yeah, and that really makes those characters more. It's weird how they get filled out as characters and become like three-dimensional, even though there isn't any of the interiority that we're talking about. There isn't a lot of like description of like what they look like or what they're doing. Like it's all being relayed in this other way. And yet like the longer you sit with them, the more real they become, and their speech seems, and it really just like defines them and becomes like a much larger representation of character than in most other books.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to, but it's also really interesting.
One what happened question. Is Miss Flesh actually killed in a car accident in that first scene? When she goes out to meet the guy who she is, the textbook salesman who's supposed to be coming, and then there's a crash at the entrance to the school parking lot. Decephalus later recovers his umbrella from which she had run off with, but I'm not sure she hasn't been killed in the crash.
I wasn't either. Like, and I was trying to figure out what was going on too. And it's like, didn't Leroy? Is it Leroy was the one that comes in to fix stuff?
He's the janitor.
The janitor, and he comes in to fix the TV, but he's also references like not helping them through this like blind curve, like to get out of the school, and that's where the crash happens. Yeah. Cars are dangerous in William Gaddis, so always.
Yeah.
What was in the bucket that the janitor?
Shit. It's shit.
It is shit. Okay.
He's been asked to clear out the toilet somewhere, and he's come back bringing the bucket to say this was what was blocking it.
Yes, that's what I thought. It is shit and money, man. Shit and money. Shit, money, and TV. This is the American world.
One funny thing he does, I thought was funny, that when he comes back to the old ladies on scene 11, that a lot of the jokes come from them misremembering what actually happened. So, for instance, there's a line when he's like, or father either. Why Mr. Cohen even wanted to hear that old story about father and the violin. And of course, Cohen didn't want to hear that. They were just chatting away, And so there's a bunch of those things that they just misremember. And then the joke around Cohen with an age, So it's almost like the joke keeps going, but now in a different sort of comedy of errors kind of thing,
Yeah. Yep. And I suppose we should talk about JR for a second as a character, because he is in here a little bit, and is the titular character, obviously, but he is the dwarf that it's a dwarf.
Aldrich, yeah.
In the ring, in Wagner's ring that they're going to put on, and as they're trying to like perform this, and Bast is playing, and the girls are supposed to be acting it out. They're like, well, we can't do this because there's no Rheingold. We need the Rheingold to go around. And so then they put the bag of money from the beginning scene on there, and of course JR steals it as like a dwarf.
It's like presumably gives him the money to write off to the mail order company, which begins his whole scheme.
Yeah,
because his family doesn't have any money. The fact that his mother's he's got a single mother, right? And he's clearly sort of a poor and a poor kid in this largely wealthy suburb. But I think he makes off with that money in order to begin his financial empire.
Yep, it does reference that he's got a stack of mail with him
Yeah,
yeah. He's sitting at the phone already, talking with the handkerchief, which he always has over the phone for the rest of the book. So that's the first glimpse of him doing his stuff. That yeah.
Yep. And then his magazines fall. His mail falls when he's running with Bass, and it falls, and you see all this stuff. And I don't know if I got that right. That does he also have like a porn magazine or something? Because like there was some like this. Yeah.
I think they're all these sort of small fine print ads. So some of them I think are ones for sex products. And so he just sort of recites the whole range of different things you can get from this, what he sees as this vast cornucopia of desirable goods, but he doesn't really have any sense of the difference between any one of them, right? I think he's just sort of reading them off, and Bast is embarrassed in that. So,
right. Yeah. And it's almost like there's like a little touching moment where like he's going like, hey mister, you want to hang out later or something, when like Bass is running, so is
it obvious why he gloms onto Bast at that point? What is the source of the attraction for a relationship that will become crucial to the book?
Yeah, I'm trying to find that. Go back to at the time, and
it wasn't clear in that scene like why JR was interested at all in Bast.
Yeah,
at least it wasn't to me.
Yeah, that's what I didn't quite get to that point. So I'm remembering from the earlier reading.
No, there's not. Yeah, it's just like they just had their first interaction. So he's like, hey, wait, you're not mad, are you? Books and papers starting right and left. He trotted up beside Bast. Where are you going? Home. Oh, you live out this way? Yes. Up the main road? Yes, but I'll walk you. I'm in a hurry. That's okay. He hurried along, bumping Bast's thigh with his arm load. How far up do you live? Past that big corner? Right off it. Like across from where they're building this here new shopping center, right? They're not building anything. That ties back into what they're talking about earlier with the tearing down of stuff. I mean, like what they're going to. Going to what? Who? You live in the big old place right after that old empty farmhouse if you turn left, right? This here old house with with these little pointy windows and this like big barn in the back by the woods with this big high scraggly hedge out front like. So that's describing it, but that's basically their whole interaction.
Yeah. Oh, but the reason that he clings on to him, if you go up to the top of my page 61, Bast says to JR, stop.
Yeah.
What? I said, wait a minute. No, you said, where's that money you stole? So I think JR is mainly concerned to prevent Bast from ratting him out. That may be the initial, and so he's trying to make friends with him, and in a way he succeeds in so. Well, I mean, he does and finally rope him in, but he succeeds at this point. He's succeeding in making Bast want never to see him again, which will work for the moment in a way.
Right. Yeah.
But I think he's trying to keep him for
too, where she's describing Mrs. Dubert, right? She's describing like what stocks they can buy. It's like, well, we have $24, so we can't buy this one, but we can't buy that one, but we could buy this. And that little bit is very fun too, and also feels very appropriate to our time.
Yeah.
Someone mentioned in the chat that part of the interest in Bast is simply that he's the only one who doesn't send JR away. Pay attention to him.
Yeah.
To some degree. And that is what you're saying, Mauro, too, at the very end, where he's like running up. He's like, hey, Mr. Bast. He called him Bast, half raised an arm without lifting his eyes from the lengthening steps. I just mean, like, maybe we could see each other sometime, okay?
Right. Yeah. It's like, kind of touching, right? It's like a little kid wanting attention,
and we don't know at this point how old Edward is.
No, that's right. We still, we know he's not an infant, but a legal infant at this point.
Right.
Right. They're like, where's his birth certificate? And they're like, I don't know. There's like stocks. And then like they pull up the drawer and it's just like stocks and stock share certificates and not the birth certificate or anything like that.
Stocks for men and bonds for women. Is that what he, That's what he said,
So, that works on several levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I guess the only other character worth really mentioning here flipping through the notes, would be the daughter.
Miss Joubert.
No. In the very last in scene 11.
Stella?
What's her name?
Oh, Stella.
Stella. I was gonna say Nellie, but Nellie is the wife, is the mother.
Yeah.
But yeah, Stella shows up and is part of this too. So
yeah,
she's sort of making sense out of what the ladies are saying within this crazy conversation, and she's trying to piece together what that actually was.
And she is Edward's cousin, right?
Edward's cousin.
First cousin, because she is James's, but she's also his half sister.
See, now we're into the Nabokov Otter moment where it's like, are they sister and brother that are having sex, or are they cousins that are having sex? Like, it's one of those. Yeah, I thought it was half. Although what I clearly don't remember is who ends up being his father. And right now, it still seems at this point, like from the text itself, seems to be held in possibilities.
Yeah, what Stella's husband is the person managing it at this point. As you'll find, I mean, you'll go to the factory fairly soon, and so she has an interest in it. I mean, as does Edward too.
Right, and she is definitely Thomas's daughter.
Thomas's daughter. Okay.
Right.
Whereas Edward, right? Well, Edward may or may not be Thomas's son or James's son. So he may be her half brother, or he may be her cousin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's sort of like that's the fun, weird part. Yeah. And that's where whatever the document is that the lawyer is leaving revolves around that. It's him stating like who his parents are, who his father is. Yeah. Anyways, okay. Anything else you guys want to touch on for this?
The only other comment, and maybe we're kind of touching this, is if you're reading this for the first time, just be on the lookout for all the jokes. They are everywhere. Like and there's one that I wanted to kind of read real quick. Is I was talking earlier that some of these passages of description that transition from one scene and how it can be a little ponderous, and then I caught myself reading one of them, and there's a joke between one of those ponderous. At least I thought it was funny, where he's like talking about a landscape, and it keeps going on and on and on and on, and it says, "And it gave way to depths of locust, long stunted in internecine struggle, now grappling with woodbine." I was like, what? So anyway, so even in the ponderous sort of, according to me, passages, you can find jokes about locusts, having fought themselves and now just, grappling with woodbine,
Edwin, do you have a favorite line from this section that you want to share?
Oh, I was underlining stuff as I went along. I mean, actually, this is just flipping through the sorts of things that come up. This is one of those passages that you were mentioning, but here you have a demented wheelbarrow choked with stalked memories of flowers. The partial, I mean, that. So, I mean, there's just interesting things going on all the time. And the other thing I wanted to know, and this is probably in Steve's thing, is that the inscription which Gall has had placed over the school, which he says has to do with Empedocles, but it doesn't look like it looks like it's nonsense. And
no, it's not nonsense either. It gets revealed on page 490, I believe. Hold on, I've got it right here because I have that open. It gets revealed, but it's a quote from Marx. To each is, it's like it's not. It's the to each his own quote.
Right. Each according to his abilities, and to each according to his needs.
Yeah, Greek letter substitutions for the English grade from each accord. This is from Marx's famous formulation, critique of the Gotha program. From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. It's identified as Marx's inscription on page 409. So yeah, I always thought it was, for some reason, I don't know that, I'm sure that this existed when I read this the first time, but I wasn't like using the internet quite the way that we do now. And Steve Moore's website, like if you haven't gone to it, is fantastic for all things William Gaddis. And this, it does have like annotations throughout, but just encapsulating the scenes and telling you like where the scenes are and who's talking, or who's going to be in them, and what the kind of subject is just a really good guidance point. But that's where I thought it was like, for whatever reason in my mind, that quote had to do with entropy as well, because of Gibbs's thing, but it's not. There's a great quote from Gibbs about art on, or there's a great quote he gives about art that's on page 51 that I was going to read, but I think the one that's my favorite line is on 48. It's from Mrs. Jobert, who's talking about buying a stock, and it just says, "Money that isn't out working and earning something is just like a lazy partner who." Yeah. Well, thank you guys for coming on here and talking about this and kicking this off. I think this season is going to be a lot of fun. We have a lot of guests lined up, and for next week we have scenes 12 through 18, which in the NYRB edition goes up to page 145, and in the earlier editions is up to page 137. So they're all pretty close. I mean, the numbers didn't change too much, but I went through and figured out exactly where they all matched up for this. So you can look at that and read, catch up, tell all your friends, rate, review. Anything you want to plug, Edwin? Any new books coming out from NYRB that you want?
Oh, I like this book Divorcing that we just reissued that came out in 1971. But I think that's well worth. And the Morcelli book, the Dissipatio HG, Dissipatio Humanus Generis, or The Vanishing, is a pretty great is a good book about all of humanity disappearing from the planet except for one man.
Sounds like Wittgenstein's mistress.
I have Divorcing. I bought it a few weeks ago, so I'm looking forward to reading it.
Oh, nice. And Mauro, talk about your book for a minute. Pitch it.
Sure. Aphasia came out November 3rd on the election day. And it's about this guy who does not want to think about what's happening to his sister who has lost her reason. So the whole book, or the majority of the book, is really a performance of delay and a performance of not thinking, of not wanting to think about something.
Interesting. Am I right that I read that this is part of a trilogy that you're writing?
Yeah, this is the first volume following Antonio and his family. I just finished writing the third part of the trilogy, which is called American Abductions, where Antonio is deported, and the whole novel is told from the point of view of his daughters that go around the world interviewing people who have been deported. And there's a talking car called Leonora Carrington. And I was able to get the rights from the Leonora Carrington States to use the stories in an algorithm that is using the talking car. So looking forward to that being a bestseller.
Oh, yeah.
we just reissued Leonora Carrington's Hearing Trumpet. So if you want the backstory behind Mauro's book, there's that too.
Exactly. Well, thank you both. We'll be here next week, and I will talk to both of you soon.
Okay. Bye. Thank you.